Welcome to MacStories Unwind, a weekly review of everything MacStories and more. This episode is brought to you by Ulysses, the ultimate writing app for Mac, iPad, and iPhone. I'm John Voorhees, and this episode of Unwind is going to be a little different. I'm doing this one solo because, you know what? I think most of you know that Federico published his iOS and iPadOS 14 review this week, the culmination of months of work. As you can imagine, he's a little tired, and I thought, you know what? Today would be a good day to let him rest and start his weekend a little bit early. So he'll be back next week, but in the meantime, I'm going to walk everybody through what was a very busy week at MacStories. It was a busy week because not only did Federico publish his review, but we also had an Apple event. But before we get to the Apple event, I want to touch on Federico's review. I'm not going to try to recap everything in this review because we'd be here pretty much the rest of the day. It's about 60,000 words. It's comprehensive, but it's more than just comprehensive. It's very insightful. I mean, Federico has lived with iOS and iPadOS 14 for months now. He uses it every day. He uses it for work. He uses it for play. He's working with it all day long, and it really shows from the review that he wrote this year. So what I want to do is give you more of a guide today of where to go depending on what you want to do. First of all, I would suggest reading the whole thing because I know it takes a long time to read 60,000 words, but I can tell you that people find things in here regardless of how well they think they know iOS and iPadOS, including Apple engineers who have contacted Federico and told them they've been on the OSs for months, if not a whole year, and learned things too. I certainly did too, myself. So the review itself deserves a full and complete read, but I also understand that people have limited time, and so we've come up with a bunch of different ways for people to kind of absorb the different aspects of what's in the review. First off, if you want to focus on the big picture themes of this year's review, I would suggest going and listening to App Stories, episode 188, because Federico and I went through the design of both the iPhone and iPad interfaces, including compact UI, and the iPad's design, the 3-column layout, pull-down menus, that sort of thing, as well as all the different pickers that are now in the OSs, which really were starting to show their age. And I'm very glad to see that Apple decided to get rid of things like, the little spinny wheels for picking dates and times and that kind of thing. So he goes through that. That's on App Stories. We also talk about the Apple Pencil with Scribble support, as well as Pencil Kit and taking handwritten notes. And of course, it being App Stories and Federico's review, we go through Shortcuts, which had fewer actions this year, but had some very important changes to things like the editor and other ways that the app works that are worth taking a look at if you're not a heavy user of Shortcuts, because I think it makes it a lot easier for people to use. So App Stories, great way to get kind of a broad overview. If you're looking for tips and tricks, one of the things we did this year for club members, and this is a club exclusive, is Federico produced an ebook of 40 tips and tricks. And, if you're a club member, you really get a lot of great perks this year. There's that ebook, an ebook of the review itself, and then another ebook that is compendium of all the summer preview series stories that were on MacStories this summer. Things that relate, many of which relate to the iOS and iPadOS 14 review, but are not in there. Things like maps, things like game controller support, things like privacy and security, app clips, the fitness app, and a whole lot more that we covered that I, Ryan, and Alex all covered over the summer on the site. We've brought it together, edited it to bring everything up to date, and published that as an ebook as well. The club members also get wallpapers that were made by Sylvia Gatta. They're really beautiful. Federico and I go into more detail on App Stories about those. And tomorrow, there's going to be a special episode of Unplugged, which is our club-only podcast, as well as a special edition of MacStories Weekly, which is our weekly newsletter for club members. That usually comes out on Fridays, but this being an incredibly busy week and the special things we have in there, we pushed it to Saturday, which we do maybe a couple of times a year to give ourselves a little extra time. But in there, you'll find a behind-the-scenes look at the making of the 3D art and animations that Brian King did, as well as a behind-the-scenes kind of making of from Federico about the review, an article by me. Ryan does some highlights from the event, and a whole lot more. So it's going to be a really big issue. I don't want to give away too much about that. All right, I guess the other thing I would mention that is probably not covered elsewhere that you want to dive into the review itself for is covering the home screen. We've done a lot of widget coverage at MacStories this week, but Federico goes into even more with his widget section. He's got a whole section on the home screen. It covers widgets. It covers the app library, where he makes fun of me and my many, many apps. I will defend myself when the time comes. Don't worry about that, Federico. I listen to Connected. And he talks about the iPad home screen and its lack of widgets on the actual home screen itself, as well as lack of an app library. And then finally, his review covers all the changes to the core apps that come with iOS. Things like the addition of Translate, the changes to messages, music, reminders, notes, home, all of that stuff. And there's really a lot there, especially with things like music and messages. There's a lot of changes there, and reminders. There's a lot of great bonuses there. So check those things out. All right. Next, I want to move on to the Apple event, which happened on Tuesday. And of course, we had a bunch of coverage over at MacStories. We got 2 new products. Of course, we got the new iPhone 12 lineup. There's now an iPhone 12 mini, iPhone 12, iPhone 12 Pro, and iPhone 12 Pro Max, and they all come out on different days. Well, not all of them. There were 2 that went on pre-order today for delivery next Friday, the 23rd, and 2 that are going to be on pre-order on November 6th for delivery on November 13th. The 2 that went on pre-order today were the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 12 Pro. The Mini and the Pro Max are the November 6th ones. And on the site, Ryan Christoffel has a very comprehensive overview of all the models and what the differences are. There are a lot of differences in the sense, especially when it comes to the camera, because the cameras have really gained a lot of new things. Some of it's software and some of it's hardware. The second product revealed this week was Apple's HomePod Mini, and the HomePod Mini is a very interesting product in my book. It is $100, $99 to be exact. It's a pretty low price point for an Apple product. It is small. It's less than 4 inches tall and wide. It's spherical. It's kind of the size of a softball, maybe. It has a guided waveform on the bottom, which creates 360 degrees of sound in a room. We don't obviously know what it sounds like. People haven't gotten these yet. They aren't in the hands of reviewers. We don't know how big of a room that the HomePod will be able to fill, but it has some interesting features that were demoed on stage. For instance, there's a new feature of Home called Intercom, where you can use the HomePod to communicate with other people in your household in different rooms. So you can communicate from HomePod to HomePod, one-to-one. You can communicate from one HomePod to all the HomePods in your house, or you can communicate to people via their Apple Watches, iPhones, iPads, via AirPods, and it even supports CarPlay. The conspicuous thing that isn't supported is the Mac, which I found really disappointing, but everything else is basically covered there. And on the HomePod, the intercom messages will play automatically. On the other devices, you'll get a notification and you'll have to press a play button, which makes sense because who knows what you're doing at the time one of these messages come in and you don't want to necessarily be interrupted. The HomePod also supports pairing in stereo pairs, although you cannot pair the small one with a big one. It controls HomeKit devices. There's a new feature called What's My Update, where you ask Siri that question, and what you get back are things like your commute, the weather, your next event, maybe a task on your task list, some news, that sort of thing. And it's smart too, Apple says. It'll adjust based on the time of the day. So, for instance, at noon or on the weekend, you won't get your commute time. At least that's what's promised. In addition to the HomePod, we learned about MagSafe returning to accessories, which is really interesting. It's a way for chargers and cases to attach to the iPhone 12 magnetically. And for the chargers, one thing that's really interesting is that it increases the delivered wattage for charging from Qi charging, which currently stands at, I believe, 7.5 watts, to double that, which is 15 watts, which is great because it just means your phone will charge that much faster if it's connected to one of these. In addition to that, I wanted to mention too that MagSafe is an interesting product because what it potentially allows goes well beyond charging and things like cases, because I could also see it being used as a way to anchor accessories to the iPhone, whether that's an external microphone or maybe some sort of light for doing photography or videography. Lots of different options there. Things that used to clamp to the phone may now be able to magnetically attach, which could make those products a little bit easier to use and perhaps a little lighter and that sort of thing. So looking forward to seeing that. The other stories we have on the site you should check out. There's a story called By the Numbers, which really just goes into all the stats and figures, and Apple had a ton of them this year, especially when it comes to the camera. So that's a great rundown of those things. There's an All the Little Things column that I did this week that goes into some of the little things that you find after the actual event. You know, Apple packs the event with a lot of facts and figures and other interesting information, but there's always something hiding in the footnotes or on a product page or that you read from another website. So I collected those all in one place. It's a great way to just kind of get through all that quickly. And of course, we have a roundup of all the videos as well and the dates for when things will be shipping. So check all of that out. Now, I also want to cover the club. I already mentioned this a little bit, but on Saturday, MacStories Weekly will be out welcoming all of our new club members because a lot of people have joined. This is a good time to join, frankly, because you can join and get all the perks from this year's review, as well as all the perks we've done for the last 5 years. Club MacStories has been around for 5 years now, and we've done a ton of content for it, and that's available to everybody, no matter when they join. So check out MacStories Weekly this weekend because, as I mentioned, we'll have a behind-the-scenes episode of MacStories Unplugged where I quiz Federico about what was different this year, what worked, what didn't. And I know that there was kind of a crisis and semi-disaster the weekend before the review came out because I was right there helping, trying to help him solve the problem. So I don't want to spoil that, but that's worth a listen. In addition to that, I have a column that talks about Apple's improving integration of its various devices via software. Apple does a really good job of integrating software and hardware when it comes to something like the iPhone or the iPad, but that's not always been the case when it comes to different devices integrating. I think that's one of the underlying themes of this month's keynote is that these devices are starting to come together and work together in a cooperative way like they really haven't before. And one of those things is, for instance, the Apple TV and the HomePod. So on top of that, Brian King and Federico do their behind the scenes in the making of both the animation and artwork, as well as Federico's writing the review. All right, I'm going to take a very short break here to thank our sponsor of both MacStories and Unwind this week, and that is Ulysses. You know, we love Ulysses. It's a fantastic text editor. It's available for the Mac, the iPad, and the iPhone, and it really has an unparalleled set of advanced features. This app is both beautifully designed. It won an Apple Design Award, after all. But what, to me, makes Ulysses special is its very careful balance between an uncluttered writing environment and the advanced tools that it offers. It's got an incredibly deep set of tools that work for everything from short documents all the way up to things like writing a novel. And what's nice about it, though, is that those advanced features are there and always easy to find and get to and use, but they're kind of out of sight until you need them, which when you're writing, it's nice to have just the blank screen in front of you without any distractions, and that is what Ulysses delivers. Recently, the app was updated, and it added both spelling and grammar checking in 20 languages. It's a really useful tool. There's also a special dashboard that has things like stats, keywords, footnotes, and an outline that's based on the headings in your documents. So, for instance, if you have a really long document, that outline not only is an outline there for you to kind of get a bird's eye view of your actual writing, but you can use it to navigate through sections of the document. So it allows you to move through thousands of words very quickly without doing a ton of scrolling, which I also appreciate. Of course, everything syncs over iCloud. It's always available, whatever device you've got. And you can do things like set goals for yourself based on things like word count and other criteria, which is good if you really are trying to form a habit to do more writing, because it can be very hard to get started. Of course, there are also lots and lots of export formats, things like PDF, plain text, Markdown, text bundle, and a whole bunch more. So check that out as well. To learn more about Ulysses, go to ulysses.app and be sure to check the link in our show notes, because we've got a special deal for listeners of this show and readers of the site. Ulysses has a 14-day free trial, but Unwind listeners can get a full 3-month trial if they use the link in the show notes, which is a great way to really get a lot of use out of Ulysses and make sure that it works for the way you work before you decide to subscribe. Again, to learn more about the app, go to ulysses.app and be sure to check out that link in the show notes. Our thanks to Ulysses for their support of MacStories and Unwind. All right, folks, you have probably heard enough of me rambling on for one day, but I've got something for you for the weekend, and that is, if you like music and you like live music, right now is not the best time. Concerts are largely canceled worldwide, and it's very hard to get a dose of your favorite bands. But I found something that I really like that I wanted to share today, and that's something that the Grammy Museum is doing. They're doing something called Relive Music Moments, and it's RE:LIVE Music Moments. There'll be a link in the show notes. But it's a series of both interviews and performances by artists from their home largely, and it's really interesting. It's quite good. So I have seen their interviews with Soccer Mommy and Billie Eilish, Grimes, FKA Twigs, Grace VanderWaal, and Phoebe Bridgers, just to give you an idea of some of my favorite artists who are involved with the project. You can go to that website and you can watch the interviews for free, which is nice. I always enjoy interviews with artists from all different fields because I find it really fascinating when someone who's really accomplished, like all these artists are, talking about their craft and talking about how they do it and the thinking behind it. Because I don't know, I find it not directly applicable to the kinds of things I do, but it to me it's just fascinating when people talk about something they're very interested in and good at and how they make it happen. And on top of that, of course, there are performances, and the performances are really well done, really well recorded, and it's not the same as being there. I'll grant you that. I have watched other live streams and things during the lockdowns and canceled events and that sort of thing over the last several months, but it's certainly better than nothing. And even when I had the opportunity to go to concerts, this is the sort of thing that I always have enjoyed to watch once in a while. So I mentioned that the interviews are free. For the performances, it's $3 a month or $30 a year. There are not a ton of them yet. I mean, I rattled off, what was it, like 6 names or so? There are more than that. There are at least 3 times that, I think. But there aren't a ton. You could definitely subscribe to this for a month or two and get through all of them probably. But at the same time, they are releasing new ones every single week. So I would suggest signing up. $3 is not a lot, and I think you'll enjoy it. Check it out, and it's a little something different. And then if you get through everything, I guess you could cancel your subscription. But it struck me as a good way not only to get a little bit of music, but also it seems like a really nice outlet to me for these artists. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode of MacStories Unwind. I want to thank our sponsor again, and that is Ulysses, the fantastic text editor. Of course, Federico is going to be back next week. You can find him all the time over at MacStories.net. He's actually got some other stories coming out relatively soon. I don't want to spill the beans on him, but as much as I would like to send him off on a month-long vacation, we've got lots more coming on the site, so stay tuned for what we're working on there. And of course, I've still got my Big Sur review, which is hanging over my head. So I've got to finish that up. But you can find us at MacStories. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. And this is where I drop in my Ciao John loop.
Ciao, John.